First, here is just some detail about the real world for fiscal policy in Kazakhstan and Central Asia. In the past 20 to 25 years, Kazakhstan has acquired a reputation for tight spending by the government when compared to other nations in Central Asia. But that matters not only in Kazakhstan but also in the United States, that some years ago had faced a kind of rebellion against deficit spending coming from the Tea Party, which basically provided part of the foundation for Trump's victory in 2016, not to mention his defeat in 2020. So, one question that we could ask is how might reducing our deficit affect trade with other countries? So, for example, the United States under Trump had treated uh, the government deficit as basically independent of the trade deficit. If Trump saw it, we could reduce the trade deficit regardless of what happens in fiscal policy. So let's take a look at whether that belief was justified. Some figures for the years up to the fiscal crisis, you can see that Kazakhstan's debt in relative terms is much smaller than in the United States. Again, uh, evidence of fiscal austerity in Kazakhstan. However, that varies in Central Asia. And in the years of the early 2010s, it tended to be very high in Kyrgyzstan, 99% of GDP, moderate in the United States, and very small in Kazakhstan. So this austerity by Kazakhstan connotes that the government is rather small relative to GDP. So you can see that again in these early years of the 2010s, the government played a small role relative to the size of the entire economy in Kazakhstan, much smaller than in Kyrgyzstan, and for that matter, even in Russia. After the financial crisis, if anything, governments in Central Asia tended to decrease in size. They were smaller than before the crisis. So that may suggest some uh, suspicion that Keynesian spending in recession is not well advised. The negative sign here applies to the deficit to the GDP. it connotes that there is not a surplus, but instead a deficit in terms of government spending as a share of GDP. Minus signs being a deficit rather than a surplus. Okay, so um, the overall point is that Central Asian governments, as a rule, have tended to rein in spending relative to GDP. Central Asia is not a believer in big government. So now let's take a look at whether uh, politics may determine how large the debt is relative to GDP in Central Asia. So let's begin with a clarification of our terms. The deficit is in a given year the amount that the government spends relative to the taxes that it collects in that year. Spending minus taxes. The debt is the sum of deficits over time. The overall amount that we owe. So you can think of the deficit as the um, increase in the past year for debt. The debt is like a stock, and the deficit is like a flow. So if government spending is small, smaller than tax revenues, then we will say that the government has a fiscal surplus. Otherwise, given spending driven taxes, we have a fiscal deficit. Okay, on those truths. I put this up because the deficit may have a different impact on the economy than the debt does. Deficit and debt differ in the way that they affect the economy. So, for example, suppose, as seems to be the case, that we had a recession in Pakistan. Then we may increase GDP through government spending in a true year. The debt is not directly relevant in terms of this short-term fiscal stimulus to GDP. However, but over the long run, deficit spending increases the debt and so may undermine the long-run confidence of investors in the government. In other words, they may doubt that the government can pay off its debts in the form of such securities as government bonds. So they are reluctant to buy any more bonds from the government. That is to say, they are reluctant to uh, prevent any more deficit spending. So the long run reputation of the government will depend on the debt to GDP ratio. Today, even though the debt to GDP ratio is rising in the United States, it still has the confidence of most financial investors around the world. That is not necessarily the case in Central Asia, especially for Kyrgyzstan. So now let's take a look at the politics of debt policy. And as time permits, perhaps look at some of the other questions here. So let me begin by asking for your own opinion. Do you think that it would be a good idea for Kazakhstan to increase its deficit today if we have a recession? What are your own thoughts? So we may
Yes,
go ahead.
yes, because when you have a recession,
Uh-huh.
you might as well. So deficit is when a government spends more money, right?
In the current year, yes. Uh-huh.
Yes. So it's better for the economy if a government spends more money to help um, to help a smaller or medium-sized enterprises at that time, in this time
Oh,
of the
okay.
year.
So as you see it, there is a short run rationale for deficit spending when we are producing below our potential. Basically, uh, the government spending will do little more except to push us closer to our capacity. Does not sound like a big problem. On the other hand, uh, the deficit will increase long-run debt perpetually because the government is borrowing money in order to spend. It is going beyond the amount of money that it had collected in taxes. It will spend even more than that. So there is the possibility that over time that they undermine the confidence that people have in bond and securities from the government of Pakistan. But not right now. Actually, Pakistan has a good reputation relative to other countries in the CIS. Okay, so here is a study of Western countries over about a quarter of the century. And it appears that the government became more conservative in the sense that they were increasing tax collections relative to GDP rather than just a fiscal deficit. So one may ask, why is that the case? Well, here is the suggestion of, as I said, for political reasons, the government tends to set tax rates too low, but not to cut spending commensurately. So we have deficits and consequently debt will rise over time. To pay this off, the government will raise taxes again, but again, because the politicians wish to remain in power, they do not raise tax rates by enough. So the debt is a signal of a long-run problem. It signals that the government has difficulty getting control of its fiscal policy. We will see whether this will destroy Kyrgyzstan in its turn political instability. And that's the paper if you're interested in reading it. Okay, so we have seen that there is some suspicion that governments are not raising taxes enough. If this is because politicians are weak, that if they do not have the confidence of the public that would permit them to raise taxes, then maybe the deficit GDP ratio will rise with political instability. So we're being in focus of the use of variable to measure the political weakness of the politicians in power. The higher the value, the weaker the party is. So, for example, in Kyrgyzstan, we have a value very close to zero because they basically have a one-party government. And then as Fried can note that the government has had to put together a coalition of parties, none of which have a majority support of the population. And there is the model. They're looking at deficit to GDP and whether that ratio depends positively or not on the variable that measures political weakness of the politician in power. And then X represents the other exogenous factors, such as interest rates. Okay, so if this hypothesis is correct about the relationship between the deficit ratio and the power of the political party or parties, what sign would you expect to be in this case? Is D positive or negative? But it should remember that a higher value for weak connotes a weaker political coalition in power. Now, if that weakness connotes that politicians cannot raise taxes, then the deficit will rise. There is, in short, a positive relationship between the deficit ratio and the measure of political instability in government. Then here are the results. D equals 0.4, the standard error of the estimate of the coefficient is 0.14. So what do you conclude? Is this evidence that weaker governments do tend to spend more than stronger governments in terms of political popularity? Or do we not have evidence yet of that hypothesis? But let's take a look at the whiteboard. So the hypothesis of interest is that politically weak governments spend more relative to GDP because they do not have the public confidence that would enable it to raise taxes. So there is a positive correlation between the deficit ratio relative to the government, relative to the size of the economy, and the instability of the parties in power. Okay, so in this case, the null hypothesis is that D is either a negative or equal to 0. If that is correct, then our hypothesis that began with is wrong. This would suggest that you don't have statistical evidence that political instability outrages the deficit spending. And then the alternative hypothesis is that D is positive. We do have evidence that political instability raises the deficit ratio. Okay, so we run a model on Western governments over about 26, 27 years. And we come up with an estimate from that sample to be of 0.4. So that seems consistent with the alternative hypothesis. In fact, there is a direct relationship between instability and deficits. However, the standard error of the coefficient estimate is also large, 0.14. Now, you remember that we defined the t-statistic in this case as the estimate of a coefficient as relative to the standard error of that estimate. And we had a rule of thumb that if t is greater than 2 in absolute value, then we would reject the null hypothesis. Which in this case means accepting the alternative hypothesis. Here, t is equal to 0.4 divided by 0.14. So, do we accept or reject the null hypothesis?
Reject.
Yeah, good. Since t is greater than 2. So there is some evidence of a connection between political weakness and deficit spending in rich Western democracies. But it's interesting to note that even if we have a government that goes all the way from 0 to speed, that is a government that had been very strong politically and suddenly becomes very weak, this will increase the deficit ratio by only 1.2 of percentage points. This seems a moderate effect if we consider that during the fiscal crisis, the deficit in GDP ratio was sometimes as large as 10 percentage points. And there is the main point so far. Okay, so let's take a look now at the other question that they had begun with. Is there a connection between the fiscal deficit of the government and the trade deficit? So we already saw that politics can contribute to the fiscal deficit. However, many other factors affect deficits as well in government. To answer this question, let's take a look at a natural model of the two deficits. There are two ways that we can define income. First, in terms of how we spend our income. We may spend our money on consumption, taxes, and anything left over, we will save, or maybe you can think of income in terms of who is spending the money. Households in consumption, firms in investment, of the government, and foreigners in terms of our exports to them, minus what we are buying from them. Okay, this suggests that we can relate the two equations to one another, since both of them are equal to y. So already you can see that we have the trade surplus in the model. So let's cancel out consumption on both sides. And then let us assume that domestic savings are just enough to take care of our investment projects. So in Pakistan, our savings at the commercial banks are sufficient to pay for factory expansion and so forth in Kazakhstan. If that is the case, then we can simplify our model even more. By eliminating savings and investment. And now we have a very simple relationship. The T connotes taxes, G government spending on goods and services, and finally the trade surplus on the right-hand side, exports minus imports. Okay, so there is a direct relationship between the fiscal surplus, tax collections in excess of our spending, and the trade surplus, where we sell goods and services to the rest of the world by greater amounts than we are buying from them. This is a consequence of what is sometimes called the basic macroeconomic identity. If this model is correct, does the trade deficit operate independently of the fiscal surplus, of what the government is doing? Well, let's see. The model suggests that if government spending rises, then that will lower the left-hand side, suggesting that the right-hand side will fall as well. So a rise in the deficit will undermine the trade surplus. The trade deficit will rise in this case. So, for example, if in a recession the government spends more money, it must accept that the trade surplus may vanish, again under the assumption that domestic savings are equal to investment. So the main point is that fiscal policy affects trade policy. We cannot treat the two policies as independent, which is what the United States tried to do in 2017-18. So I will pause there for our discussion of fiscal policy. Any questions up to this point? Are you comfortable with this relationship between the fiscal surplus and the trade surplus? Here's one intuition. Suppose that the government will buy in force. So, for example, maybe Kazakhstan's government will buy oil pipelines that are produced elsewhere. Then the trade deficit will rise, which is consistent with a rise in the fiscal deficit as well. Let's move on now to talk a bit about economic growth. Uh, we saw that in the short run, deficit spending can stimulate the national economy. However, it may undermine economic growth because the government is not saving money that could create infrastructure in the future. Or for that matter, consumers may not be uh, may not be saving enough money to finance private projects of investment. So, in the Keynesian perspective, in the short run, government spending can stimulate the economy. But in the long run, from the point of view of the anti-Keynesians, that spending may raise interest rates. And just make it too expensive for firms or for the matter households to borrow money for investment projects. So, for example, students of, let me say, youths may not be able to afford to borrow money to pay tuition into the college because the interest rate is too high. And in that case, in the long run, the economy may slow down because of a lack of investment in public and human capital. Do you think that we may have that problem in Kazakhstan today? Just your own opinion. Then how might we test this argument that deficit spending may slow down economic growth? Let's say if the argument is correct, then we should observe a correlation between the interest rate and the concurrent deficit. So for Kazakhstan, maybe they could gather data for the interest rate in your tea, also data on the deficit amount of the ratio, and then finally any other factors that may affect interest rates, such as the global interest rate. If it is true that deficit spending can raise interest rates, but to be know about the coefficient be positive or negative. Surely it would be positive if the conservative argument about the long run uh, long run businesses created in the economy by deficit spending is correct. So there is a paper that you could write, perhaps a master's thesis, to begin to worry about deficit spending in Kazakhstan. So far, the conventional wisdom in Kazakhstan seems to have been that this argument is correct. This deficit spending may raise interest rates and thus reduce investment in the capital created by that investment. So, with that background about the link between fiscal policy and economic growth, let's look at a simple model. There is a relationship between savings today and capital tomorrow. So a nation in this model may be able to trade off short-run stimulus spending and economic growth in the future. More savings means less consumption. However, we may ask whether saving is the only way that an economy can grow. So, of course, technology may play a role as well. Good. So let's take a look then at a model of production in the national economy and how it may affect economic growth. So why is national income or output? Output is a function of a stock of capital and of a labor force as well. Here is a very popular model for output. where the powers of the inputs are added up to one. A nice thing about this model is that it makes it possible for us to predict very simply what happens at output when our inputs are increasing. If we have a 1% increase in capital and labor, then we will have a 1% increase in output as well. So, or more generally, if each input is increasing by a factor of beta, output should rise by beta as well. For example, maybe beta is equal to 1.01, which is a 1% increase in inputs. Then output should rise by 1% also. And here is a numerical example of that argument, if this will help you to understand what underlies constant returns. In this case, we suppose that both capital and labor are doubling. Today, capital is twice as large as it was last year. But let's expand the expression for capital and for labor. So we have just taken the powers and then applied them to both terms in parentheses. This suggests that we have a term of 2 to the power of alpha plus 1 minus alpha. Eliminate and simplify. Now we have the output, which is represented by this product of capital and labor. Output has doubled because of the doubling in capital and labor. So there is the mathematics behind the example. Okay, now we would like to have a formula for labor productivity. In other words, the average output of a typical worker in Kazakhstan. If we have constant returns to scale, then this is very simple. All that we have to do is to set beta equal to 1 over L, which is basically the size of the labor force. Okay, so we apply the value of beta on both sides of the equation. On the left-hand side, we have output per worker or labor productivity. And on the right-hand side, we see that productivity is a function of the capital to labor ratio. So now we have a very simple model of the national economy. Output per worker depends on capital per worker. . And there is an example of for the top builder production function. Uh, in this case, as the capital labor ratio increases, output per worker will also increase, but at a diminishing rate. So, although the first derivative is positive, the second derivative is negative in this case. And I will let you show that for extra credit. There is a graph of labor productivity and the capital to labor ratio. Let's put the model to work. Of Fiscal strong. Here is output per worker, which we can also very roughly interpret as income per capita in real terms. So we suppose that the labor force is proportional to the population. And we say that it depends on the capital labor ratio, but at the diminishing rate. Good. Now, let's apply this model to government policy in Kazakhstan. You are familiar with the policy that in uh, English is called enforced industrialization. Although this is a mistranslation, it really means accelerated industrial policy, industrialization. The mistranslation occurs because the Russian word for acceleration sounds like forced in English. So this policy tries to increase the number of factories, of the number of training schools, and so to increase capital per worker. How might that affect output per capita or labor productivity? What do you think? Let's see. Uh, Suppose that today in 2020, the technical information is right here. I, I will call this the technical information with the subscript 0. And according to the model, this alone will determine on afterwards. Okay, so now we have this policy that will raise capital per worker. What happens next? Now we have a higher ratio, more machines, more computers per worker. Called the new triple digit ratio with the subscript 1. What happens now to productivity?
It increases.
The prices, yeah, good. Exactly. So the government's um, policy is not entirely foolish. There is a possibility that it can increase our economy in the long run. But in the short run, if this policy is financed with tax increases, what happens to the economy in the short run? They have a fall in GDP because people are saving more money in order to pay off the taxes. So once again, we have this trade-off between short-run prosperity and long-run growth. Okay, so I will stop there.